All right, welcome everybody to Frank Analysis. I'm your host Franco, and I'm joined today by author John Potash. He's the author of these two books right here that I have with me, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur, as well as Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And he is returning to the show, so I've interviewed him before. So if you're interested in the first part, you can check out that video. I'll have it linked in the description. And we're here to talk about John Potash's sequel to Drugs as Weapons Against Us called CIA Drugs Are Us. John, it's great to have you on here. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on again.
So, what does this sequel focus more on compared to what the first book and movie focused on?
So the sequel, CI Drugs Are Us, is it continues with a more comic perspective, like angle on some of the drugs as weapons against us content, and then follows up with some of the new information about the key musicians and the key activists that drugs as weapons against us talked about. In particular, John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, and Tupac Shakur, and also the Students for Democratic Society, new information about them, and new information about the Black Panthers. And so now it also gets more into uh, basically the way the Manson family was used by the CIA's Project MKUltra, and evidence that the church sex abuse scandal
Mhm.
is linked to the CIA's MKUltra program, particularly with in Baltimore where I live, and Father Joseph Maskell, who was made infamous in the Emmy-nominated docu-series *The Keepers* that was on Netflix in 2017.
Yeah, and I recommend everybody both reading the book and checking out the documentary. The documentary also opens up by talking about families such as the Russell family and the Cabot family and how they were opium traders. And they were founders of major universities like Yale, Harvard, Columbia University. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So I recapped some of that in the very beginning of CI Drugs Are Us, but I got more into it in Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And so basically, these wealthiest families gained their wealth partly through opium trading and opium shipping in the 1700s, and then they founded the many of the Ivy League colleges, and I show all the evidence of that, and show a national writer who talks about that in his book. He had written James Bradley had written some award-winning books such as Flags of Our Fathers that was turned into a Clint Eastwood movie, and then wrote a book called Imperial Cruise, which was about the opium shipping families and their connections to the highest powers, the government, etc. And so he talked about the fact that the Cabots founded Harvard University, and they were opium shippers. The Russells founded Yale University, and were, of course, tied with opium shipping. The Pierponts, who were benefactors of Harvard, and some of the founders of Harvard, were also tied with opium shipping, and they were intermarried with the other families, the Russells, and the Greens founded Princeton. The Lows founded Columbia University, and yeah, they made a lot of their money off of this opium shipping, and they never stopped being involved in the opium trade when it became more lucrative because it was made illegal with the heroin trade. And so, J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan, the Pierpont is from the Pierpont opium shipping family that he's a part of. His ships were caught with loads, a ton of cocaine, just in the last 5 or 10 years, coming into Philadelphia with a ton of cocaine. And so this is still goes on today, sadly enough. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And why did they want there to be a connection between opium and higher education? What do you think?
well, I argue that they were using their wealth, their incredible wealth they made off the opium shipping, to have more control over society, and part of that is by having starting the what's considered the most prestigious colleges and universities. Excuse me. And when they control the universities, they can control the kind of where knowledge comes from and what's
Yeah.
considered our facts and our knowledge about society. So many people will quote these top professors from these top, what's considered these top universities as if they're the source of knowledge. And when these big wealthiest families have so much power in through these colleges and can give fellowships and endowed chairs to these professors, they can have a lot of influence over these professors and a lot of influence on what kind of information they put out there, and that's generally the way it works.
Right. So they're like the gatekeepers of information.
Right.
Um, and people have the appeal to authority, logical fallacy, like they have their trust in these figures from higher education. So I can see why all of that makes sense and connects. It reminds me of the Chicago Boys and how the uprising of Pinochet in Chile started with the help of the University of Chicago, was it? Or I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Well, I am familiar with the rise of Pinochet and a lot of the, conservative element at University of Chicago. I didn't know they were connected though as much as that through the years. I do know that America's what was it called? Operation Condor was majorly involved in a lot of the rising of these, dictators in South American countries, along with the Nazis that were given refuge, and
Yeah.
which is in part of my film CIA Drugs Are Us, and
Yeah.
also Drugs as Weapons Against Us. We gave fugitive status to tens of thousands of Nazis. U.S. Justice Department admitted at least 10,000 Nazis that were given refuge in Central and South America. But a German historian down there said it was about 50,000 Nazis that were saved down there, and including one of some of those notorious ones who I make jokes out of in my CI Drugs Are Us about, Klaus Barbie and all. But and so he said basically that they were helping out they were leading the military coups. They were uh, helping the cocaine drug lords, and Barbie was considered the minister for cocaine. He was like the most influential advisor to the minister of cocaine. They called the guy in power in Bolivia, and so he helped the cocaine coup in Bolivia happen, and taught these soldiers that led the coup how to enrich themselves. He said, obviously with drug money, and so yeah, this is some of the way that worked down there. And so they both make money off of it. They control populations in those countries. They take away democracy, and they took away democracy in Chile, obviously.
Yeah.
And Salvador Allende became one of the first independent elected presidents of Chile after the U.S. controlled the dictator of Chile before that. Um, they then took Dr. Salvador Allende. He was a medical doctor, and before he became president, and they yeah, as you said, led the rise of Pinochet to overthrow him and overthrow all the good things he was going to be doing for society, for that country. And that you can just repeat that in many of those Latin American countries, what the way we meddled down there through with Operation Condor and our agents down there.
Yeah, this is I'm glad you're bringing up Operation Condor because you also talk about another operation in CIA Drugs R Us, and that's Operation Paperclip. What can you tell us about that?
So that's what brought Nazi scientists that were working with different drugs and experimenting with them on concentration camp victims, and they just brought loads of those scientists into the U.S. and put many of them into the CIA's Project MKUltra, and so different professors like such as Al McCoy have talked about that in their books that discuss Operation Paperclip and MKUltra. And a man named Kurt Plotner was one of those Nazi scientists, for example. But and so they then basically took those experiments, used them in the U.S. and used them arguably on Americans. And so this operation, this project MKUltra was an umbrella project with 149 sub projects on mostly the use of drugs as unconventional warfare. It says in their documents. And when people think of warfare, they think of in foreign, war in foreign lands. But that warfare, turns out, all the evidence shows, was actually on anyone who dissented from, with the American oligarchs' racist pro-war agenda, or the pro-war agenda in other countries that were working with the U.S. intelligence. And so I show the evidence that LSD was one of their biggest drugs, and there's loads of MKUltra documents on LSD and the use of LSD in all kinds of experiments and dissemination throughout the communities that were pro-war. That were doing anti-war protests and civil rights work, and but also the use of many other drugs, other super psychedelics they came up with in MKUltra, along with cocaine and heroin and a number of other drugs. So yeah, and I discussed that at length about how they use those drugs, both kind of using what they call fake grassroots, like an AstroTurf campaign. It's a public relations term for fake grassroots, and they had MKUltra scientists at parties that seemed like they were grassroots parties, just like people coming up with these parties. They called the acid tests in the San Francisco area, where a writer named Ken Kesey organized them with a bunch of group they called themselves the Merry Pranksters, who were filled with military officers. And so they pretended to be something, just people trying to have fun, when it seemed to be actually a military operation. And the Grateful Dead band played at those parties, and those parties got bigger and bigger. It became the Trips Festival. It went from hundreds of people to thousands of people, then became the Human Beings, where there was over 10,000 people. And then they became huge rock concerts. And of course, everyone loves rock concerts, but a lot of these rock concerts, they were experimenting on, they let acid distributors run amok, and they were distributing LSD and selling all kinds of super psychedelics such as BZ and STP and DMT that were really hurting people's minds. And a lot of these people were young, idealistic anti-war protesters and civil rights activists. But in the East Coast, they were doing that out of first, they were MKUltra's funding through a front group called the Human Ecology Fund that was giving money to about 45 universities around the country, over 40 prisons, and over 40 hospitals around the country were experimenting on people. Ken Kesey had come out of the San Francisco hospital experiment. It was actually a Stanford hospital experiment right near San Francisco. And in the East Coast, it was Timothy Leary was getting MKUltra money, and saying he actually knew, he was one of the professors that actually knew he was working for the CIA since 1962. He said in an interview. And when Harvard got wind of him doing just so many experiments with acid and doing stuff with drugs outside of the experiments, they kicked him and some of his cohorts out of Harvard. But immediately, Timothy Leary got funded by a group called sister and brother, William Mellon Hitchcock and Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, of the wealthy Mellon Hitchcock family. And the Mellons owned Mellon Bank, and the Hitchcocks owned Gulf Oil. So they were some of the oligarchical families. They were incredibly wealthy, and they were also had high posts in U.S. intelligence. And so they gave Timothy Leary, let him use this Millbrook mansion for, rented to him for pennies. And MKUltra scientists just camped out in this mansion about an hour north of New York City. and they lured all kinds of writers and artists and musicians up to these constant parties at this Millbrook mansion, where they would just experiment and just use, test, give them all these super psychedelics, acid, LSD, DMT, STP, all these BZ, all these super psychedelics, and experiment with them on them, but also get them to promote the psychedelics in New York City, to which is the kind of the capital of the arts and the media, and get them to promote it, on the East Coast. And they lured a lot of civil rights activists from New York City up to that Millbrook Mansion parties too, and got them tripping, sadly enough, and hurt their
Yeah.
minds with this stuff.
Why do you think that why do you think they wanted to use Nazi scientists to experiment on these psychedelics and stuff? Is it because the Germans were already studying this stuff during World
Yeah,
War II?
they were already experimenting with mescaline and other psychedelics on these concentration camp victims, and so they were ahead of the game on this stuff, and they brought them in to continue their experiments on Americans, and so that's just, yeah, that's why they did it, and they shared the same ideology, sadly enough, as these Nazi scientists. A lot of these American oligarchs were incredibly racist, incredibly prejudiced against all sorts of minorities, Jews, Catholics, etc. And they had the American oligarchs had actually given the initial funds to Hitler and Hitler's brown shirts. It was American eugenics that turned into Nazism in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're taking advantage of how these minority groups are low income, right? So they expose them to these drugs on these people who are being oppressed, and they don't want them to educate themselves enough to realize that they are being oppressed and how they
Right.
can use certain tactics from history of when these empires have fallen, right? It was the people who have taken down these empires before. And so a way that they can keep these people oppressed is by affecting their mind. It's a war on the mind, right? And they're using these drugs as weapons, as you say. Um, so you also mentioned Bayer,
Mm-hmm.
which is also German. And then they turned opium to heroin, and Bayer's aspirin is also pretty much a product that they have, right? And you made a joke in the movie about how Bayer's aspirin from the people that brought you heroin. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Bear aspirin, yeah, as you say, it came out of it was part of IG Farben, huge chemical conglomerate in Germany. And IG Farben ran Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp in Germany. It was like several cities worth of concentration camps in one. And so they just got free labor. They worked people to death, obviously. They're they worked them to death and gassed others, and so they have such an ugly history, Bear, and they is known as for children, selling children's aspirins if they're all good and all soft and sweet, but they really came out with opium and then heroin, created heroin, and really didn't care. It was about using opiates for control. It really wasn't about helping people, and now they bought out Monsanto, and
Yeah.
Monsanto it came up with all kinds of franken foods, genetically modified organisms for corn and all that to kind of hurt people's health, because indigenous people from all over the Americas have developed all kinds of healthy corn, healthy strains of different vegetables and crops, and Monsanto and Bayer now have developed all kinds of really genetically modified forms just to sell their pesticides, hurt people's health, and tried to. And people in countries like Mexico have defied them and kind of kicked them out and tried to do away with genetically modified plants and crops. And many European countries have done the same thing.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because Bayer is involved in the chemical industry, just like how they're involved in the pharmaceutical industry. and it really hits home for me because I've been affected by this. I had a family member who's died from non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which, upon the research that I've done, is linked to glyphosate, which is a chemical that's used by Roundup pesticides. And now Roundup, which was owned by Monsanto, now bought by Bayer, has control over that.
Yeah,
And I'm far from the only one who's been affected by this. It's millions of people with
sure.
loved ones who've been affected with
Yeah,
this and had non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
yeah.
But yeah, what
Robert
can you?
Kennedy
Yeah, go
Jr.
ahead.
I say Robert Kennedy Jr., who's in my film talking about the assassination of his father and uncle, President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy Sr., the senator who was about to be president in 1968. He won a major lawsuit against Bayer and Monsanto over them causing cancer with their glyphosate. I think you pronounce it
Yeah,
how it's
glyphosate.
yeah, and so he's won some major victories against these companies, these huge companies like them, and also DuPont for polluting the waters and people like that. So um, it's very, it's like the same people attacking and causing cancers in lots of people with their pesticides are also assassinating people that rise up to the top to try to change things for the better because President John Kennedy did try to close down MKUltra, but they kept it running behind his back. And when he found out they were running behind his back, he tried to close it down again. And of course, then they changed the name of it to MK Search, and he was assassinated. Now, he was assassinated for many reasons, and I'm sure shutting down MKUltra is just one of them. But yeah, that's what they've done to people that go against them.
Um, so with Bayer, can you tell us, do you know enough about like the history behind it? Like who founded Bayer? And is this similar to like other, like what we were talking about earlier about the families who made their profit off of opium trade and their connection to universities and banks? What do you know about that?
Well, I don't know enough about Bear except the fact that the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgan families were kind of united in the early 1900s in terms of with their eugenics movement, and then united in their business interests. United in they use the same law firm, the Dulles law firm, and Allen Dulles was the first one of the first civilian CIA director. John Foster Dulles, his brother, was one of the first Secretary of States right after the CIA was founded, and um, and they connected their business interests with IG Farben, which Bear was part of. So they all have connected business interests, these groups. So that's basically what I do know about them. Yeah, and so I got more into that in my book Drugs as Weapons Against Us, in my first film Drugs as Weapons Against Us. In CIA Drugs Are Us, I get more into the new operations and the use of undercover agents, for example, I show the evidence of to infiltrate the Students for Democratic Society and to couple with the one-time leader of the Students for Democratic Society, Bernardine Dorn. So a guy named Bill Ayers was the son of one of these oligarchs, one of these members of the billionaire families, and Tom Ayers was on the board of directors of General Dynamics Defense Contractors, for example. He was on the board of Sears Roebuck, the top department store in the country, top department store chain. He owned the Tribune Company, a huge media company, and also the gas and electric for most of Illinois and Chicago and Illinois in general. And so here he is. He's a billionaire, and his son, Tom Ayers is a billionaire, and his son Bill Ayers uh, gets himself to be head of the ST Students for Democratic Society at University of Michigan, which was the largest anti-war group in the country, and he gets himself close with Bernardine Dorn and ends up really having the most influence at breaking up the Students for Democratic Society, and ends up starting a new group with called the Weathermen, that became also changed their name to Weather Underground. But that's just one example of what the FBI even boasted about the fact that now that SDS is broken up, they're much more now that they're split in two, they're much weaker, and he helped effect that split of them into two groups, and had them break up within a year. Um, and he became head of one of the two groups that he split it up into. So things like that, the kind of use of these chemicals, and I argue that he helped affect that with spreading the use of acid in University of Michigan SDS and the National SDS, and encouraging Bernie Dorn to take more acid and to hurt her best thinking and make her, because research finds that acid can make people hypersuggestible
Hmm.
and emotionally less in control. And so that's some of the ways they use that. But then, I should also talk about, of course, the Manson family coming in and, basically affecting what I have in the new film about the MK Ultra's work in the Manson family. It was based on a book that came out in 2019 by Tom O'Neill, and he found that his book Chaos found the letters going back and forth between the head of MKUltra, a guy named Sidney Gottlieb, and a guy named Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who had in his papers said he had perfected the use of drugs and hypnosis to cause people to do whatever he wanted them to do.
Hmm.
And so he stationed himself at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, where Manson and these following of girls, young girls, and some young guys went at least weekly for 6 months, if not every day for 6 months. And it's the best evidence is that he was using these techniques to help Charles Manson, hypnotize, sexually assault, and use drugs to turn these girls into what they became as robotic murderers. And when they attacked the that home of Sharon Tate in Los Angeles, they were attacking a whole group of actors that had become activists in support of the Black Panthers, and they called themselves the White Panthers in solidarity with Black Panthers. And they also were part of the Peace and Freedom Party, that was anti-war party. And these were some of the top actors of their day: Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland, people like that. And Jane Seberg, I think her name was. But there was a number of top actors all meeting at Sharon Tate's house and to do this kind of activist work. And they were meeting there regularly. And here comes these Manson girls, and they they kill, Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger and others in the house, and they write the words "pig" and blood and their blood
Hmm.
on the walls and make it look like it was actually according to FBI documents, they were trying to make it look like it was the Black Panthers that did it. Um, and they tried to blame it on the Black Panthers at first, but then they found they were, some honest police officers actually ended up arresting them, the Manson family, and found who it really was. But that scared the rest of the actors into stopping their activism and their support of the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers, of course, was one of the top Black activist groups in the country at the time in terms of for the Black community.
Yeah, this the Manson family, like this is like a cult, and but like to lure people in was Manson like promoting like an expansion of consciousness. It seems like an infiltration, right? Because
Right.
wanting peace, wanting to end the war of Vietnam or just war in general has to do with consciousness, right? Educating yourself and being mindful of other people and not wanting to hurt other people, wanting to elevate other people. So were they using, well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's much of a question, but I think I just want to hear your thoughts on it. Like, how are they using these drugs as a promotion to elevate consciousness? Saying that, yeah, these drugs, like if everybody just did drugs, everything will be peaceful and everything. When I look at the history of psychedelics, like how they were used for ritualistic purposes, like in the Americas and by the San Bushmen people thousands of years ago. It was done so, as I mentioned, is for ritual purposes. It was done so responsibly and with
Right. It's very different that way. They use
exactly
ayahuasca or other uh, drugs like that in a ritualistic way every now and then. That's a safe, healthier way to use some of these natural drugs. We're
as
talking about
opposed to recreationally.
yeah, as
Yeah,
opposed to recreationally, and we're talking about these synthetic drugs that are very
yeah,
different than the natural type of drugs. And the synthetic drugs like LSD, STP, DMT, BZ, these super psychedelics, they were all used in a different way, and they were used to hurt people's minds.
yeah.
And they were used to make people more suggestible, have less control of their emotions, and they were pushed on people for in that way. And so they, after the Manson family was going into this Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic for 6 months, they then moved to Los Angeles, where they befriended kind of stars in Los Angeles, including the Beach Boys drummers Dennis Wilson, and moved into his house for 6 months. And so they went to these Laurel Canyon parties also, where the oligarchs kind of had some of their own young people become instant stars in the music industry because they had the most kind of influence and power over the media in general, but particularly the music industry. And they could do that. They could get people on television and make them instant stars. Now, for example, Barbara Sears Rockefeller's cousin, Vito Palakis, set himself up with a dance studio in this Laurel Canyon area of Los Angeles, and just had a bunch of girls taking dance lessons, and he turned them into dancers for these new rising rock stars in the kind of LA area. And they held down the Manson family. It was brought in with these young girls who had been turned into sort of robots, that and where they would hold constant sex and drug parties from about 1965 onwards, but particularly after the Mansons came in 67, 68, 69, and they would basically hold these sex and drug parties to lure a bunch of actors in LA and Hollywood and musicians that were coming through to these parties, and then introduce them to all different kinds of drugs, acid, LSD, heroin, cocaine, etc. And then also, with the orgies, they lure them in and then introduce them to drugs, maybe get them hooked on some of the drugs, get them inadvertently promoting some of these drugs, and possibly even blackmailing them, because some of these girls, Manson girls, were underage girls, so like 13 years old. And if they caught them on film, they could blackmail them that way. So there was a lot of different agendas going on at once, and best evidence is that some of these people that were throwing these huge sex and drug parties, like Vito Palakis, the Rockefeller cousin, and people like David Van Cortlandt Crosby of the Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Byrds. His family were the Van Cortlandts, and the Van Cortlandts owned 1,000 acres in the Bronx. They were an incredibly wealthy family. They donated their estate to create Van Cortlandt Park, which was this massive area in the Bronx that they owned. And so that's kind of families that some of these people came from. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, who wrote the song California Dreamin', which was top of the charts
Yeah.
in the 60s. He was in the Naval Academy, and his father was a military intelligence officer. And so he basically did some outrageous things. He held constant sex and drug parties, but he also did incredible, outrageous things to his daughter. And he
Yeah.
was, yeah. And so I get into that now. Granted, most of the film, I also create a lot of parody songs and try to make it comic because it's just so dark. Want people to just take just to have some comic relief throughout. It's just so not to be so down the whole time about it all. But it is dark stuff. It's a dark history, So
Absolutely. Yeah. And this book right here, which you talk about, goes really into depth with this. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan. But there's a lot of coincidental passing aways that happen from with people who are from there. And which you also talk about the parties that were hosted by David Crosby, Papa John, Frank
Right.
Zappa. And I know you don't talk about you haven't talked about this before in your work, but they sound a lot like the Diddy parties that we hear making the rounds now in the news. So it seems like these things have been going on for a long time, and it seems like they're still going on today. So do you know of other places aside from like Laurel Canyon where these orgy parties and what's the nature of these types of parties?
Yeah, and so I don't know that much about the Diddy parties, and a lot of the information does come from the FBI. So it's just I'm not 100% sure I trust the
Yeah.
FBI's information.
Mm.
But it's possible Diddy could have been, influenced to do the same things as these other, as these Laurel Canyon type parties. Yeah, as I say, they seem to be ways, like the Epstein parties. Really, so that's what they're
Yeah.
into. At the Epstein parties, they lured so many influential, powerful. Sorry about the
Oh,
light
you're
coming
fine.
screening it. But they lured so many influential people to these parties, turned them on to drugs and sex with underage girls, and then blackmailed them to get them to do what they wanted. And that was Epstein was, according to the best evidence, was part of U.S. and Israeli intelligence. Him and his wife, Ghislaine Maxwell. So I talk about him in my film, and CIA Drugs Are
Yeah.
Us too, because of that, because it was similar type operations. And so this is, yeah, some of the ways they controlled things and manipulated groups and got people to inadvertently promote these more dangerous drugs. And so I show the evidence of how, they basically dosed John Lennon to get him to try acid, and involuntarily. But then David Van Cortlandt Crosby influenced John Lennon and George Harrison to trip a second time 6 months later, and it voluntarily at that time. And then Lennon ends up thinking he's losing his mind on acid, and George Harrison gives up acid in '67. John Lennon gave it up in '67, and 2 years later they get someone comes into his life, this Yoko Ono, who comes from
Hmm.
a wealthy aristocratic family of Japan, and gets him convinces John Lennon to trip again. And his publicist also joined Yoko Ono in convincing John Lennon to trip again. But when he started tripping again, he ends up finding that he can't even go out and do concerts because he's lost so much emotional control. He's throwing up before he comes. He says he threw up for hours. I have him in an interview on my film saying he threw up for hours before going on stage. He got so anxious and nervous about going on stage and performing, despite performing with the Beatles for a decade before that. So in a new journalist book who was friends with John Lennon and Yoko Ono said that Yoko Ono introduced John to heroin, when heroin is a way to really control someone because of the physical withdrawals of heroin and the way that affects you. And so this is some of the ways that they did what they did. I'm just gonna move over a little so that light doesn't come into me again. But so I yeah, I showed how they worked, the best evidence of what they did in that regard to control John Lennon before
Yeah.
they got away from drugs and they got more into activism, and then they did him in. And that same modus operandi was used in the for with Kurt Cobain, who was called the John Lennon of his generation, because he was into activism, though not as blatantly as John Lennon, and he was also became, arguably the most influential musician of his generation at that time when he died. And Courtney Love, the best evidence was, had kind of been abused growing up and got into all kinds of drugs. Was according to her biological father and other biographies on her, she was prostituting herself and became either a knowing or unknowing agent of the CIA in that regard of to try to control Kurt Cobain, turn him on to heroin, have him develop a heroin habit, and then when he sobered up and got away from heroin, according to an blood test before a month before he died, he had no illicit drugs in his system whatsoever. And anyone who knows heroin habits knows you can't go a day without heroin without going to serious withdrawal symptoms if you have a heroin habit. So he didn't have a heroin habit before he died, is the best evidence, and so they did him in to stop him from promoting sobriety and getting more into activism. It appears the best evidence is U.S. intelligence did that, and they covered up the fact that Cobain was actually murdered. And this comes from a former uh, police detective in Los Angeles who became a private detective who investigated it all. And the best evidence on U.S. intelligence is the fact the way they covered it up. There was an FBI file came out in the last few years that where they pretend like they didn't have jurisdiction over his case, and they were being sent all this evidence that Courtney Love like offered $50,000 to a guy named Eldon Hoke who said this on film in the film Kurt and Courtney, and I have in my film CIA Drugs Are Us that she offered me 50 grand to kill her husband and to come from Los Angeles to Seattle, Washington to kill her husband. And but before since he was out on tour when she came to give him the money, she gave it to someone else instead. And he said that on film. And within a few days of saying that on film, he died mysteriously. And the guy he said took the money was the last person seen with him. And so that all that evidence was sent to the FBI, and the FBI said it wasn't in their jurisdiction. I showed the evidence it was in their jurisdiction, and then of course I showed the evidence about Tupac Shakur
Hmm.
because he was a lifelong activist, only pretending to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. And he was getting loads of gangs to call peace truces with conflict, warring gangs, and turn on to activism and to stop drug dealing throughout the country. And for that, of course, they did him in, sadly enough.
There's
And I
so
should
many
be,
patterns there, so many patterns that just seem like it's too good to be just coincidental with
yeah,
people coming into their lives that introduce them to drugs, whereas before they weren't that big into it.
mm-hmm.
But then they enter the party scene, then there's people that just get so close to them in their life and start giving them drugs. And then these songs about drugs and partying and other materialistic things are what get promoted, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to songs that are more conscious or educational, or like I haven't heard any mainstream song about like promoting a sober life or anything like that.
Right.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean that's the way the
it's
media
sad.
industry does it. The media is controlled by the oligarchs, and insiders have said this, like Chuck D from Public Enemy said, they promote the written negative rappers, and they don't promote the positive, rap artists. So that's what they do.
Yeah. Since the last time you came on, there was news about Keefe D and Orlando Brown being the ones who did Tupac in.
Yeah,
And now with all the stuff about Diddy coming out, people are saying, "Oh, Diddy had something to do with it too." Which I know in your books you make the argument that Keefe D was a fall guy to all this. So can you tell us more
yeah,
about uh all this news that's coming out about Keefe D, why it's most likely bogus?
yeah. Keefe D and his nephew were the patsies. I mean, like the British top award winning documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who happened to make a film called Kurt and Courtney about Cobain, and another film about called Biggie and Tupac about Tupac Shakur. He ended up making a follow up to that Biggie and Tupac, and in about 2021. And so he showed the evidence that basically that I mean, he had first said in interviews that he thought that that Orlando Brown, I believe his name was, that who took a beating like right after the Mike Tyson fight,
Yeah.
that Tupac was kind of influenced to attend. There was a scuffle in the MGM Grand Hotel, and this Orlando was kind of involved, took a beating from a few people in death row, including Tupac. He was drunk and stoned at the time, was influenced to get involved. And then it just really lasted only about 10, 15 seconds, is according to the best evidence. And then Orlando ends up not even saying anything about it, but his uncle Keefe D, who they arrested, saying he was involved in Tupac's murder. He says that his nephew Orlando went to the hospital, went to the ER emergency room, and has got his shoulder got messed up in that little scuffle, and he has his arm in a sling, his right arm in a sling. He said, and then he said they went together and killed Tupac right after that, which is a joke because it only happened. Tupac only died maybe now a couple hours after the Mike Tyson fight. And anyone knows when you go to the emergency room, especially in an incredibly busy time like a Mike Tyson fight in Las
Mhm.
Vegas, it takes hours usually to get seen, and then you get then your shoulder's so messed up you're in a sling, but yet you shoot a pistol, and he says KBD says his nephew who got murdered himself a year or two after that is his nephew's the one who killed Tupac. It's the police experts on that say like Russell Poole, who investigated, said it had to be done by police because you really it's a sophisticated operation to find Tupac, to execute him, and to get away, and for police to let them get away. It's just all ridiculously sophisticated that it had to be police or someone, an expert professional that did that, and not just some teenage gangbanger like Orlando Brown. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, and so I show the evidence that KPD was lying, and that Greg Kading, who was brought in as a disinformation agent, I argue, was a disgraced police officer. I show how he lied in these situations because his own police chief contradicted him about some of the information around this situation.
And Tupac was being surveilled at that time. So it's like if he was being surveilled, then wouldn't they know who his actual murderer was, right?
Right.
Why is this
Sure.
this big mystery that's been going on for decades now?
Right. Yeah. So
Um, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, it's just they know exactly what happened, and they're just covering up all the evidence. And I in my book I have some of the even the police saying how we have a closet full of evidence that we're not going to show anyone. We're told not to show anyone. So yeah.
Can you tell us who Reggie Wright Jr. is and who his father was?
Yeah, so Reggie Wright Jr. was a head of death row police, security, and his father was Reggie Wright Sr. was head of Compton Police Gang Unit, and that was one of the first gang units. I mean, that was one of the neighborhoods, the first areas to call peace truces between the Bloods and the Crips gangs that normally warred over drug dealing turf, and Tupac and his Black Panther extended family were key to making that peace truce happen in those neighborhoods, and then throughout Los Angeles, and then throughout California, and that spread throughout the country. There's peace truces and turning on to activism.
Yeah, and what Russell Poole, the detective you mentioned, was investigating them, correct?
Yeah, so he was investigating the Biggie Smalls murder, and after doing that, uh, he found that there was dozens of his fellow police officers at all levels of death row records. And when he asked the superiors what are they doing there, they told him you can call them troubleshooters or covert agents. So it was obvious that they were running an operation out of death row records. And death row records, best evidence is turns out to be a front company for drug trafficking, gun trafficking, and the murder of Tupac Shakur.
Yeah. So last question here. What advice would you give someone who is undergoing substance abuse or substance addiction, since we see that this is still a big problem in our country, also in the world, but how can we fight against this? What advice would you give someone
So
undergoing this addiction? Yeah.
my first decade of doing psychotherapy for a living, which I've been doing psychotherapy for a living for the last 35 plus years. My first decade was just in addictions, and then I branched out to being doing addictions and mental health counseling, and then I started doing less and less addictions and more mental health counseling, and then within the last 10 years, I've become kind of an expert on trauma therapy with using EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is I think is the gold standard for treating PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But in my years of doing addictions counseling, I've found that the best thing, the recipe for long-term recovery, is professional counseling plus 12-step groups, plus if you need it, some kind of medication that helps with maybe either the alcohol issue or the particular drug issue that you're having a problem with. There's certain medications that can help with that in order to cut down the cravings or things like that, or Suboxone just temporarily for the first maybe 6 months to 2 years until you wean off that, and you have a solid foundation of sobriety along with your 12-step groups, going regularly, having a sponsor, having a support network, and that is the recipe for long-term recovery.
Great. John Potash, thanks again for joining the show. Do you want to leave the viewers with a final message as well as information on where they can find your work?
Yeah, I just hope people can stay sober and struggle against this the oligarchy that currently controls our country and sadly so much of our world right now. And they can find my work at johnpotash.com, www.johnpotash.com. And the DVD has 18 plus bonus scene minutes and can be bought at Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And it can be seen for free with some ads on Tubi or without ads on YouTube movie rentals or Google Play. And so those are some of the places you can find it.
Great. And again, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks so much.
And yeah, yeah. And for everybody else, there is a part one of this interview when John came on about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. So I highly recommend checking that out and to check out the rest of his work. Thanks for watching, everybody.